history tells that in the 16th century, the great Inca Empire fled from the ferocious onslaught of Spanish conquistadors. Somewhere deep inside the jungles of Peru, the Incas built a last stronghold. There, they made their final stand against their ruthless enemy. But with their death, the memory of where this last refuge was disappeared. But one man was determined to find it. An American explorer named Hiram Bingham.
He was Indiana Jones. He was 6'4", he looked like a Hollywood idol. He was a man obsessed with this mission.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
And he did find an extraordinary Inca city. Machu-Pichu. It was hailed as the lost city in the clouds. A spiritual Inca refuge, perching high on top of a skyscraping mountain. Bingham was convinced he had found the long-lost city of the Incas, their final refuge from the Spanish conquest. But all was not as it seemed. In 1911, there was a young scholar specializing in modern Latin American history at Yale University, USA, Hiram Bingham. But he was no impoverished academic. Bingham was 36 years old, married to Alfreda Mitchell, an heiress to the Tiffany Diamond Empire. They had 6 young sons and lived in a 30-roomed mansion on top of a hill. He was a man who seemed to have all the comforts of life. But Bingham was restless and driven.
Hiram Bingham had a really compulsive need to become famous, and I think that's because of his family.
He was Hiram Bingham III, and I think that's incredibly important because his grandfather, Hiram Bingham I, he was a very powerful, impressive missionary character, and so was his father, Hiram Bingham II. So there's this legacy, this weight on his shoulders that he had to prove himself or do something with his life at the very least.
What that something could be, he had absolutely no idea. To secure a permanent position at Yale University, Bingham went to Peru in 1909 to study the Spanish trade routes between Buenos Aires and Lima. During the journey, he was invited by his guide to see an ancient Inca site high up in the Andes Mountains. It was an event that would change his life.
It was my first introduction to prehistoric American history. I agreed, not knowing that it was going to lead me into a fascinating field.
Bingham is taken to this remote Inca ruin called Choqquequirao, which means cradle of gold, and is immediately struck by the romance of the position.
The Inca ruins lay 10,000 feet above sea level, and the climb was astounding, with breathtaking views of the distant snow-capped mountains and the roar of the Apurimac River below. It was also exhilarating.
At times, the trail was so steep that it was easier to go on all fours than to attempt to walk erect. Most of the time, we were hanging on to the side of the mountain almost by our eyelids.
On the way up, they saw amazing sights, including a huge condor that sailed down to take a look at them.
We could not only see his cruel beak and great talons, but even the whites of his eyes. It was an awe-inspiring moment.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
Eventually, they reached the Inca ruins on the flattened peak. For Bingham, it was a magical experience. Choqquequirau was built in the 15th century and was believed to be a sacred Inca dwelling and one of their frontier fortresses. It was designed to defend the approaches to their great capital city, Cusco. Bingham wrote to his wife Alfreda to tell her it was the most interesting place he had ever seen.
He's amazingly impressed by the remains of Inca architecture because he'd never known about this before. He'd heard of the Incas, but he didn't know that what they'd achieved was quite as impressive as this. Some people see this as a sort of epiphany, you know, this really changes the direction of his life.
Till now, Bingham's knowledge of South American history was limited to the Spanish colonial days, and he knew very little about the Incas. As he looked out to the distant mountains, Bingham was keen to find out more about them. Who were these people who built this extraordinary place? What was their story?
Those snow-capped peaks in an unknown and unexplored part of Peru fascinated me greatly. They tempted me to go see what lay beyond.
And he thought of this line from Kipling.
Something hidden. Go and find it. Go and look behind the ranges.
You get this feeling that this worked on him, on his imagination, that somewhere just beyond the range was a city, a world, a reputation to be found.
Back in the Yale Library, Bingham began researching the Inca history. He opened the pages of the Spanish Chronicles, a key source on Spain's golden age of discovery, conquest, and colonization of the Americas.
He began reading more about the Incas. And of course, even as a non-academic, the story of the Conquistadors and the Incas is incredibly exciting.
Bingham learned how from the early 13th century to the middle to late 16th century, the Incas were the most powerful empire in the Americas. Their domain stretched over 2,000 miles, from modern-day Chile to the Amazon. But then came catastrophe. In 1532, the Spanish conquistadors, headed by their ruthless leader, Francisco Pizarro, entered the Inca heartland. He was hell-bent on their destruction. Over the next 40 years, the Spaniards drove the Indians from their cities and slaughtered them in their thousands.
Bingham really is intrigued by the history of the last Incas and what they'd done after the Spaniards arrived.
Bingham's eyes were drawn to an account where a young Inca emperor named Manco had led his people as they fled their capital city, Cusco, in 1536. Manco managed to escape the Spanish and created a new Inca capital called Vitcos, 10,000 feet above sea level, somewhere in the remote mountainous region of the Vilcabamba Valley. But the Spanish conquistadors were in hot pursuit. and the Incas fled again. This time, the chronicles said, they went down from their mountain homes into the Amazon lowland. There, protected by a dense jungle in the largest rainforest in the world, they built a new city called Vilcabamba. And it was here that the Incas made their last stand. But it was all to no avail. In 1572, the Spaniards finally defeated the Incas. And so with their death, their last refuge, Vilcabamba, disappeared from history. Bingham was transfixed by the story of Vilcabamba. But for all the references of the city, there was one vital clue missing.
Nobody, as far as he could see, knew where it was. This appealed to Bingham as a puzzle he could solve himself.
Bingham tried to work out where Vilcabamba could be. The Spanish chronicles said it lay 30 miles and 2 long days' journey from Vitcos. But he had no idea even where Vitcos was. Continuing his studies, he found another clue. The chronicles said that Vitcos was 100 miles northwest of Cusco, along the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range. Bingham knew where Cusco was. He had visited it on his last trip to South America. But if no one knew where Vitcos was, how would he know when he'd reached it? There was a further clue in the Spanish accounts. They said that there was a sacred area with a large white rock close by the city. So if Bingham could locate the white rock, he would know he had found Vitcos. Now Bingham realized that if he could find Vitcos, then 2 days beyond it, he should be able to find Vilcabamba. This, Bingham thought, would be how he could make his name. He would lead an expedition to find the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba. Bingham began to form his team.
He needed to be funded to take an expedition down there, particularly then. It was an expensive business.
The first thing Bingham did was approach a number of corporations. Businesses specializing in America's outdoor country pursuits offered their support. Abercrombie and Fitch supplied Bingham with an explorer's outfit.
He managed to get Winchester to give him a rifle, Kodak to give a camera, and then he turned to his classmates.
Bingham estimated that he would need 6 expedition members and that each one would require $1,800 to cover their travel and food expenses. One former classmate heard about his plans and offered him $1,800 if he would take a Yale geologist with him. Bingham snapped up the offer. Others came forward. One was a topographer, another a mountain climbing engineer. Eventually, Bingham got together a multidisciplinary team.
So he's got a doctor, a naturalist, geologist, a couple of topographers. So it's a pretty good, well-rounded, versatile team.
To pay his own way, Bingham promised to write 4 articles for the fashionable Harper's magazine. But he was still $1,800 short. Only now did he turn to the one source he could rely on, his wife Alfreda, to tap the Tiffany fortune. She agreed. Bingham's party left New York for Peru on the 8th of June, 1911. Their destination? The former Inca capital city, Cusco. This, Bingham knew, lay near the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range and would be his starting off point. Bingham's expedition arrived in Cusco on the 2nd of July, 1911. His aim was to first locate the sacred white rock at Vitkos, then to make his way down from the mountains into the lowland Amazon jungle to search for Vilcabamba. Bingham and his best friend, a naturalist named Harry Foote, set out on the morning of the 19th of July 1911 on their quest for where they believed Vilcabamba could be. The rest of the party were dispatched to carry out geological and mapping surveys of the Andes.
So they head off across the high-altitude lands, then descend into the Urubamba Valley itself. And the Urubamba is the famous sacred valley of the Incas, and follow the river along, sort of heading generally in the direction northwest.
Bingham kept a meticulous diary of his expedition. Today, it is regarded as one of the greatest first-hand accounts in the history of exploration.
I had entered the marvelous canyon of the Urubamba. Here the river runs through gigantic mountains of granite. I know of nowhere in the world that can compare with it.
Bingham writes in the most compulsive way. He's someone with academic authority, and yet he knows how to tell a good story.
Not only does it have great snow peaks looming above the clouds more than 2 miles overhead, it also has, in striking contrast, orchids and tree ferns, and the mysterious witchery of the jungle.
He paints pictures with words, and not just of visual things, but of the heart, you know, the spirit, what you're feeling.
One is drawn irresistibly onward by ever-recurring surprises, through a deep and winding gorge, turning and twisting past overhanging cliffs of incredible height.
He's still got a little way to go before he gets to this area where he thinks he's going to find Vitkos, the old Inca capital. So he's sort of working himself in, working the team in.
On the evening of the 23rd of July 1911, after a 70-mile journey from Cusco and 3/4 of the way to where Vitkos is said to be, Bingham and Foote set up camp for the night in a canyon surrounded by steep mountains.
They camp at a place called Mandor Pampa, and they meet a man there called Melchor Arteaga. And he questions him. He says, are there ruins around here?
Arteaga told Bingham there were some fine ones on top of the opposite mountain called Huayna-Picchu, and also on a ridge called Machu-Picchu, or Old Peak.
People in Peru were always telling him that if he gave them a bit of money, they could lead him to a ruin. And there was a little bit of sort of won't get fooled again feeling in his team.
They had heard ruins were around many times, and they'd gone, it would be one little house or a couple of things.
And this is where I think we have to give a lot of credit to Bingham, because lesser men would have said, oh, for God's sake, there's not supposed to be anything up that hill. There's nothing in the history books. This is just a wild goose chase.
Bingham noted the ruins' names in his pocket diary and arranged for Arteaga to take him there the following day. The morning of the 24th of July, 1911, dawned with a cold rain. Bingham prepared for his climb up Machu-Picchu. His best friend Harry Foote didn't fancy the wet conditions.
The naturalist said there were more butterflies near the river. Anyway, it was my job to investigate. Arteaga shivered. He said it was too hard to climb for such a wet day. But when he found out that I was willing to pay him 3 or 4 times the ordinary daily wage, he finally agreed to go.
Arteaga and Bingham left the camp at 10 a.m.
After a walk of about 3/4 of an hour, Arteaga left the main road and plunged down through the bank of the river. Here there was a primitive bridge which crossed the roaring rapids. It was obvious that no one could live for an instant in the icy cold rapids, but would immediately be dashed to pieces against the rocks.
He said, I admit freely, I was on my hands and knees going really, really slowly across. And all I could think of was, I hope the water doesn't go up because it'll just take the bridge away.
After the river came the mountain.
Leaving the stream, we now struggled up the bank through dense jungle. And in a few minutes, reached the bottom of a very precipitous slope. For an hour and 20 minutes, we had a hard climb. A good part of the distance, we went on all fours, sometimes holding on by our fingernails.
Bingham was now climbing at nearly 8,000 feet.
Bingham was going up through very difficult cloud forest. Conditions were humid, it was hard work.
Shortly after noon, just as we were completely exhausted, we reached several good-natured Indians who were pleasantly surprised by our unexpected arrival. It seemed that these Indians had chosen this eagle's nest for their home.
A small boy named Pablo Richarte was sent on to guide Bingham around the ruins.
Led by this little boy around a corner, and he sees something quite extraordinary.
Hardly had we left and rounded the promontory, then we were confronted with an unexpected sight. a great flight of beautifully constructed stone-faced terraces, perhaps 100 of them, each hundreds of feet long and 10 feet high. They had recently been rescued from the jungle by the Indians.
It is an amazingly evocative description of firstly going through what were lovely Inca terraces, Bingham says, and then slowly things build.
From the cleared stonework, he was introduced to another spectacular sight.
Suddenly, without warning, under a huge overhanging ledge, the boy showed me a cave beautifully lined with the finest cut stone.
And then he's going from one wonder to another.
It had evidently been a royal mausoleum. On top of this particular ledge was a semicircular building whose outer wall, gently sloping and slightly curved, bore a striking resemblance to the famous Temple of the Sun in Cusco. Clearly, it was the work of a master artist.
Then there's the temple with the rounded wall, and then cumulatively, the overall effect.
Bingham was stunned by its magnificence and realized that this wasn't just some little Inca settlement he has come to see.
It seemed like an unbelievable dream. Dimly, I began to realize that this wall and its adjoining semicircular temple over the cave were as fine as the finest stonework in the world. It fairly took my breath away. What could this place be? Why had no one given us any idea of it? Surprise followed surprise in bewildering succession. Suddenly, we found ourselves standing in front of the ruins of two of the finest and most interesting structures in ancient America.
There are cyclopean stones, as he calls them. Stones the height of a human, but beautifully worked with very, very fine granite.
On the east side of the plaza was another amazing structure, the ruins of a temple containing 3 great windows looking out over the canyon to the rising sun. Like its neighbor, it is unique among Inca ruins.
Bingham had made an extraordinary discovery. It seemed almost too good to be true.
Would anyone believe what I had found? Fortunately, in this land where accuracy in reporting what one has seen is not a prevailing characteristic of travelers, I had a good camera, and the sun was shining.
I know that he had a very special Kodak camera that was made for traveling in rugged territory, and the negatives are huge. So the resolution, you know, the detail is really fantastic.
But one question puzzled Bingham. Where was he?
Now, Bingham was not really looking for a ruin in this part of the world, so he couldn't make sense of what he'd found.
Machu-Picchu laid 70 miles from Cusco, so it couldn't be Vitcos, which was said to be 100 miles from Cusco. And it couldn't be the Inca's last refuge, Vilcabamba, because that was said to be 30 miles on from Vitkos, down on the jungle plains. So what was this astonishing place? Suddenly, Bingham's eye focused on some charcoaled graffiti on a rock of the three-windowed temple. Lizarraga, 1902. His blood ran cold.
Bingham was a man who wanted to make a name for himself, and he was pulled up short. He suddenly saw this graffiti. Had some scholar got there first?
Bingham wrote the name Lizarraga 1902 in his diary and prayed it wasn't another explorer.
Maybe he'd been picked to the post. Maybe this wasn't really a discovery at all.
Deeply worried, Bingham made his way back down the mountain. He hardly mentioned the Machu-Picchu ruins when he returned to the campsite below. In fact, his best friend, Harry Foote, wrote in his diary, "No special things to note." Bingham discreetly asked Arteaga about the Lizarraga 1902 graffiti. Arteaga told Bingham, "Augustin Lizarraga is the discoverer of Machu Picchu. He lives at San Miguel Bridge, just downstream of your campsite."
And at that point, Hiram Bingham must have sighed and thought, oh, that is that. And he actually writes it in his diary. Lizarraga is the discoverer. And his heart must have sunk.
Bingham was horrified and set off to find the mysterious Lizarraga. But when he got to San Miguel Bridge, Augustin Lizarraga was not at home. So Bingham spoke to his brother, Angel. Angel told him that the ruins were known in the valley and parts of it were cultivated by farmers. His brother was one of those farmers. Bingham relaxed. Lizarraga wasn't a rival academic after all. He was just a local Peruvian peasant. Bingham's discovery of Machu Picchu was secure. The very next day, he set off on another long journey to search for the last refuge of the Incas, Vilcabamba. But first, he had to locate the White Rock at Vitkos. Bingham followed the information detailed in the Spanish chronicles he had read back at Yale. He asked every local they passed if they knew the whereabouts of any ruins in the area, and paid local guides to lead him onwards.
He carries on down the valley into even more uncharted territory. He's put the whole thing of Machu Picchu to one side.
"15 days after encountering the ruins of Machu Picchu, Bingham came across the sacred White Rock, mentioned in the chronicles as being close to the Incas' capital city, Vitkos.
It was late on the afternoon of August 9th, 1911, when I first saw this remarkable shrine. We could now be fairly sure that we had located one of Manco's capitals, Vitkos.
If Bingham had found the ruins of the former Inca city, Vitkos, it meant that he had to be on the right track. and close to completing his objective, finding their last refuge, Vilcabamba. The Chronicle said it was a long 2-day journey from Vitkos.
By now, Bingham's blood is up. I mean, he realized that these ruins are toppling over like 9 pins. You know, he's found Machu-Picchu, he's found Vitkos, and there's one final place he wants to find, which is a place where the Inca emperor and the exiles escaped to if the Spanish ever came looking for them.
Bingham came down from the mountains into the huge lowland jungles of the Amazon. This was now a very different world to the ethereal mountaintops of Machu-Picchu. It was a place that even the local Peruvians feared, like the Spanish conquistadors before them.
One of our informants said the Inca city was called Espiritu Pampa, or the Plain of the Ghosts, to be reached only by a hard trail passable for barefooted savages, but scarcely available for us unless we chose to go on our hands and knees.
Finally, after several days traveling, Bingham found, beneath the thick twines of a rainforest jungle, evidence of some ruins. To his excitement, the locals called it Espiritu Pampa. Even better, they also called it Vilcabamba. Surely, Bingham had found the last refuge of the Incas. But as he set to work, he came across something very puzzling. The few buildings he had found were clearly Inca, but their stonework was rough and inferior. Bingham searched for more extensive ruins, but failed to find anything substantial. Bingham wrote in his diary,
After several days digging, ruins well scattered, long hard job to clear ruins, hardly worthwhile.
The more Bingham dug, the more he became convinced that the site just wasn't special enough to be Vilcabamba. But if this wasn't the place where the Incas had their last refuge, then where was it? Slowly, Bingham started to reconsider the evidence. He went back to the Spanish chronicles. They told him that Vilcabamba was the largest city in the province. Machu-Picchu was clearly much bigger than anything he had found in the jungle. Then there was the puzzling issue of the inferior architecture. Nothing he saw in the Amazon matched the finely cut stone at Machu-Picchu. Bingham also wondered about something else. Would the Incas, who are highland people, have really made a home down in the flatland jungle?
It does not seem reasonable that such people would have cared to live in the hot valley of Espiritu Pampa. These Inca ruins are unique in lying so low in the Amazon jungle. The difference in climate is as great as that between Scotland and Egypt. Furthermore, they could have found the seclusion and safety which they craved just as well in several other parts of the province, particularly at Machu-Picchu.
Now he began focusing on another issue. The chronicles stated that the city of Vilcabamba lay 2 days' march from Vitkos. So did Machu Picchu, albeit in a different direction.
Machu Picchu was roughly 2 days from Vitkos if you walked across, and he did it. He walked from Vitkos across back to Machu Picchu directly.
An idea slowly began to dawn on him. Could his discovery, Machu Picchu, be the real Vilcabamba? Bingham returned to America at the end of 1911, determined to prove his case.
After Bingham discovered Machu Picchu in 1911, there was very little publicity. Tiny mentions in the New York Times and the Geographical magazine in London, but nothing much.
Bingham revisited Machu Picchu in 1912, increasingly convinced it was Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Incas. He was now head of a major excavation and clearing program, funded by Yale and the National Geographic Society. Looking over the tangled city, Bingham wrote in his diary,
Machu Picchu ruins as fine as ever. Very impressive.
the material Bingham produced was so impressive that the National Geographic devoted an entire issue of their magazine to his discovery.
The owner of National Geographic magazine said, we're going to make Machu Picchu a star, and moreover, Mr. Bingham, we're going to make you a star as well.
In April 1913, with the cover title, In the Wonderland of Peru, National Geographic published in pictures and text Bingham's amazing account of his finding of Machu Picchu. The news was a global sensation. The public needed little convincing. Finally, it became accepted that Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the Inca's final refuge. And Hiram Bingham's name was made. Hiram Bingham would go down in history as one of the all-time great explorers. But there is an irony in this tale. Machu Picchu was an amazing Inca site. However, modern scholars now believe that the ruins at Espiritu Pampa, which Bingham had dismissed in 1911, are far grander and larger than he had realized.
In 1964, some 50 years after Bingham had been there, an American called Gene Savoy, an adventurer and archaeologist, went down to Espiritu Pampa and did a much more thorough clearing of the site, and established really beyond doubt that that was indeed the proper last refuge of the Incas, which I think all archaeologists would agree today.
Bingham's initial detective work that had led him to Espiritu Pampa had been on the right trail after all. He had found the real Vilcabamba. He just hadn't realized it. So if Machu Picchu wasn't the last refuge of the Incas, what was it? Today, Machu Picchu is believed to have been built by the Incas during the expansion of their empire in the mid-15th century, 75 years before the Spanish arrived. It was constructed as a royal estate and served as a sacred and seasonal retreat for the Inca rulers whenever the weather was severe in their capital city, Cusco.
Everyone now tends to the view that it was built as a winter palace for an Inca emperor, probably the greatest of them all, Pachacuti. He could come down with his retinue to Machu Picchu, which has a much better climate, and enjoy a fabulous resort-type atmosphere. It was a very exclusive place, which is perhaps why there was no historical record of it. It was a place where an emperor could build his own fantasy creation in the clouds, a sort of Las Vegas, if you like, which, if it didn't have neon billboards, did have this show-off architecture that only an emperor could afford.
Scholars now believe Machu Picchu was abandoned by the Incas long before the Spanish arrived in Peru in 1532. Why they left their great winter retreat, however, remains a mystery. So where does that leave Hiram Bingham today? Was he just an adventurer who allowed his prejudice and emotions to get the better of him? Most would regard that as too harsh. To many explorers, he remains a hero.
Hiram Bingham was the perfect man of the moment. Here was a character with a dream, someone who wished to find treasure, and that is exactly what he did.
He made the discovery both of Machu Picchu and of other very important Inca sites. I think in many ways he is a bit of a hero, and rather more of a hero perhaps than Indiana Jones, because he's real.
He was the first scientific discoverer, the man who took the time, brought money to the enterprise, who exposed Machu Picchu to the world, literally peeling back that forest and showing us what an extraordinary place it was.
I was so happy that he had had the energy and the curiosity and the drive to find Machu Picchu, to rediscover it, to write about it, to make it famous to the whole world so other people could come and really enjoy it.
Despite being wrong about Vilcabamba and Machu Picchu, Hiram Bingham is still regarded as one of the greatest explorers of his age. After all, perhaps, he found one of the great wonders of the modern world.
The sanctuary was lost for centuries because this ridge is in the most inaccessible corner of the most inaccessible section of the Central Andes. No part of the highlands of Peru is better defended by natural bulwarks. A stupendous canyon whose rock is granite and whose precipices are frequently 1,000 feet sheer. Yet here, in a remote part of the canyon, on a narrow ridge flanked by tremendous precipices, a highly civilized people, artistic, inventive, well-organized, and capable of sustained endeavor at some time in the distant past, built themselves a sanctuary for the worship of the sun.
Yamashta's gold is one of the greatest treasure hoards ever known.
In today's currency, it represents over $100 billion in value.
According to the myth, this incredible fortune was the proceeds of ruthless Japanese looting throughout Asia during World War II. For one amateur treasure hunter, finding the gold became a lifelong obsession.
If he had to get down on his hands and knees and dig with his fingers until they bled, I see him being that kind of man.
But little did he know, he had a mighty rival, one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century.
Marcos was unquestionably a thug. He was a gangster.
Just when this penniless Filipino had riches beyond his wildest dreams within his grasp, his quest turned into a nightmare.
He's put a target on his back.
This is the extraordinary story of Roger Rojas.
He was willing to be David against Goliath.
Roger was a hero.
And the legend of Yamashta's gold. In May 1970, amateur treasure hunter Roger Rojas was combing the jungles around his hometown of Baguio in the northern Philippines. For over a decade, he'd spent every spare moment searching for a long-lost hoard of treasure. He'd put all his money into his quest. Unless he found it, he faced ruin. Then, after weeks of back-breaking work, at last, Roger spotted something. Had he finally found what he'd been looking for his entire life? Had he found Yamashta's gold? The legend of Yamashta's gold is one of the greatest stories of war loot in history. By 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army had successfully invaded all of Southeast Asia. As they advanced, they mercilessly ransacked country after country. They stole on a massive scale, reportedly unrivaled in military history.
Yamashita's gold is wealth beyond belief. People wouldn't believe how much it is. $1 trillion worth. So it's a mind-blowing amount.
The mastermind heading this covert operation, codenamed the Golden Lily, was said to be Prince Chichibu, the emperor's brother.
This guy is brilliant. Prince Chichibu was a perfect choice to head up the Golden Lily because he wasn't just a military man, he was an Oxford scholar, and he brought an incredible amount of creativity and lateral thinking to how we'll go about this complex process of looting.
The Golden Lily operatives just completely took everything from all the countries. They left them with nothing. They invaded, they took all their wealth, and just left them penniless.
It wasn't just banks and financial institutions, but it also had museums, temples, art galleries, rare books, anything that was worth money. They knew about it, knew where it was, how much it was worth, and they took it. The Golden Lily's looting was so comprehensive, they even targeted the underworld, the gangster world, the black markets, and they absolutely drained them of anything that was of value.
Having amassed treasures of all shapes and sizes, the Golden Lily's mission was far from over. They needed to get it back home, to Japan. First, they melted the gold into easy-to-move ingots. But this smelting also served a shadier purpose.
When gold is made, it's stamped, and you can tell where it came from. But when it's been resmelted, you don't know where it came from. So they wanted to stamp the little sign on the gold bars that the gold was actually made in Japan. Then it would look like the gold was Japanese gold of Japanese origin.
This stolen gold was then brought to the Philippines. There it was inventoried and then sent on to Japan by ship.
The Philippines was chosen as the Golden Lily's transportation hub because it was pretty much in the center of the vast Japanese empire.
For the first year of operations, the Golden Lily's transportation network ran like clockwork. But then, the tide of the war turned. In June 1942, Japanese and US forces met near the tiny Pacific island of Midway. Over just 4 days, the US forces sank 5 Japanese ships. They destroyed 270 aircraft and killed 3,500 men. The Japanese had lost control of the seas. Now it was too risky for them to ship the gold home. They needed a new plan. They turned to their finest fighting general, Tomoyuki Yamashita.
He has an incredible track record. Nobody has the reputation he does, and if anyone can pull one out of the hat, it would be him.
Yamashita made his name when he caused the greatest humiliation of the British Army in its history. In December 1941, he invaded Malaya, sweeping down the peninsula in only a matter of weeks. Yamashita then captured the British military stronghold of Singapore.
Hitherto, both Malaya and Singapore had been thought to be completely unassailable, that the British were totally in charge militarily, and he proved them wrong. He made the British capitulate, and it was the biggest capitulation of the British Army in British military history.
Virtually overnight, Yamashita took nearly 100,000 Allied soldiers prisoner. His victory sent shockwaves across the world and earned Yamashita his fearsome nickname, the Tiger of Malaya. With the gold now stuck in the Philippines, Yamashita was being asked to come up with another miracle. The story goes, he was told to hide the gold until it was safe to move it. He identified 175 suitable burial sites across the Philippines. They would hold the gold until the Japanese were once again victorious. And the Philippines proved the ideal place to hide this treasure.
They put it in very isolated parts throughout the Philippines, mostly covered by very mountainous terrain and a thick, thick jungle. Once you got these tunnels built, it would become virtually impossible to see that there had been anything ever buried there because of the growth rate in the jungle.
It said Yamashita ordered detailed maps to be made of the exact location of each treasure vault. And each map was carefully encoded.
These maps were done in an old Japanese dialect called kanji, a language which is between 1,500 and 2,000 years old, and there were no topographical references on them. They used the old characters to represent certain landmarks.
Unless you knew the complex code, these maps were meaningless. And there were even further layers of security.
Bombs, grenades, decoy walls that would lead you into another trap.
The Golden Lily left nothing to chance. And they had a vast system of booby traps that consisted of poisonous gas, explosives, complex use of the water table. So if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to drown in your pursuit of reaching the treasures.
But the maps that were drawn highlighted where all those traps were. If you didn't have a map and you went into one of these treasure vaults, it's very likely that you wouldn't come out alive.
And to ensure all the treasure vault locations remained top secret, the number of people in the know was ruthlessly kept to a minimum.
They use prisoner of war or local slave labor to build the actual treasure vaults. And the people who are building it don't know why, but that's irrelevant. They're gonna die anyway. So they're usually killed, shot on the spot.
But for all Yamashita's efforts, the gold still wasn't safe. In October 1944, the Americans landed in the Philippines. The fighting that followed was the bloodiest of the Pacific War.
The fighting in the Philippines at the end of the war was extremely brutal.
Yamashita would fight to the very last man for the emperor.
But even a master tactician like Yamashita couldn't stop the Americans' advance.
The Philippines has 7,000 plus islands and is very, very difficult to defend against an invading force. Yamashita, as a great general, would have known that.
Yamashita faced a crisis. He knew he couldn't hold the Philippines. All he could do was drag out the fight for as long as possible. And it seemed there was one particular reason Yamashita needed to buy himself time. He still hadn't finished burying the gold.
Golden Lily are running out of time and desperate. So they've got these ships in the harbor with gold that they need to get into the tunnels. They have no time. What do? They scuttle them and sink them.
April 1945. Yamashita had been forced to retreat back to the mountains around the northern city of Baguio.
Their systematic hiding of their national treasure becomes less systematic and more panicked. They need to do it immediately because they're about to suffer defeat. 174 treasure vaults done and dusted. Only one is left.
With time running out, Yamashita ordered the chief engineers to seal the final treasure vault.
These engineers knew everything. They knew how the maps were made. They knew where the burial sites were. They knew how they were booby-trapped.
What they didn't know was Yamashita had one last move to protect the gold. The story goes that while the engineers were carrying out his orders, Yamashita sealed the vault himself. The engineers were still inside. Now, they would be its guardians for eternity. Three months later, World War II was over. General Yamashita was put on trial for war crimes.
Did you at any time issue any orders directing the killing of non-combatant citizens?
Absolutely not. Anything.
The trial lasted just over 5 weeks.
The commission finds you guilty as charged and sentences you to death by hanging.
Yamashita took the secrets of the gold to his grave. There was only one other person who allegedly knew of the gold's whereabouts: Prince Chichibu. And in 1953, he died of TB.
Anybody who knew anything about this treasure is now dead.
It seemed Yamashita's gold was lost forever. But in the Philippines, after the horrors of war, the legend of Yamashita's gold lived on.
There were lots and lots of rumors that the Japanese had buried treasure all over the Philippines.
It's almost a national obsession. Everybody across the country is aware of it, and everyone's looking for it.
Among those who'd grown up with stories about the gold was a young Filipino locksmith. Rogelio Rojas, better known as Roger, was born in 1943, just as Yamashita's gold was being buried.
Roger's childhood was really difficult. The Philippines are extremely impoverished. His family is impoverished.
Roger was one of millions of Filipinos growing up in the shadow of World War II.
The war had devastated the Philippines. Manila was absolutely on its knees in a way that no other city in the whole of the Second World War, other than Warsaw. It was dreadful. Hundreds of thousands killed, families broken up, desperate poverty, no real economy going. It was in a really bad state.
So it was no surprise that the legend of Yamashita's gold just took Roger by heart at a very young age. Someone that poor with a possibility of obtaining wealth beyond your wildest dreams, of course you're going to go for it.
Roger the locksmith lived in Baguio, the northern city, near to where Yamashita made his last stand.
Roger surmises that they must have hid some of the treasure around his town. So he looks around his town right from the start, because he knows logically that's probably one of the best places to start.
Roger was a very diligent man. Every spare moment he was out there working, seeing what he could find, eliminating areas, and continuing to move forward in a very logical, progressive manner.
To help him in his quest, Roger scrimped and saved and bought himself a metal detector. Yet all Roger had ever managed to find were a few old coins and some Japanese ammunition. But that didn't shake his faith. One day he was sure he would come across the treasure he'd been dreaming of since he was a boy.
No matter how many disappointments a treasure hunter has, they will always keep going.
Then, in 1961, after years of hunting the gold with just youthful optimism, Roger had what seemed to be a breakthrough. He got the kind of clue he'd been longing for, a map of a tunnel complex. There were lots of maps and sketches like this in treasure hunting circles at the time. Roger had seen plenty of them before, but all had been fakes. This one was different. This map had come from a Japanese soldier.
He's convinced that this is the real deal.
Trouble was, the map was in the Golden Lily's fiendishly complex code.
it's a needle in a haystack, and you don't even know where the haystack is because the map has no topographical features.
But Roger also knew that this Japanese soldier had been in Baguio with a group of engineers as they buried gold during the final days of Yamashita's retreat. The map allegedly related to one of those treasure vaults.
It was getting closer. He could feel it.
Roger never gives up. And the reason is he knows the treasure is there. And he knows that year after year, if nothing else, he's eliminating where it isn't.
Yet for all his high hopes, Roger just couldn't crack the map's code. And so, even after looking for several more years, he was still no closer to finding Yamashita's gold. But at least the map confirmed to Roger his first instincts were right. There had to be treasure somewhere around Baguio.
He knows it's there. This is not a myth. This is historical fact.
Then Roger met a man who seemed to offer him his next breakthrough, Eusebio Okubo. Okubo told Roger he had served under the Japanese as an interpreter during their occupation of the Philippines.
There were a lot of Filipinos who claimed to know where Japanese buried treasure was, mainly because an awful lot of Filipinos had, perforce, worked with the Japanese, not necessarily what we would call collaborators, but simply because the Japanese needed cooks, drivers, interpreters, all that sort of thing.
When Roger met Okubo, he would have had mixed feelings. Here's somebody who colluded with the enemy.
Okubo confessed he had served none other than General Yamashita. While working for him, Okubo had witnessed Yamashita taking a large quantity of gold to Baguio towards the very end of the war. And then, Okubo revealed the crucial piece of information Roger was after. This gold was in wooden boxes, stashed in a tunnel not far from Baguio General Hospital.
So this was the final link. This allowed him to tie the bow together and have the perfect package. Now he knows where to go, he knows where to dig. He was elated because it now pinpointed the area for him to look at.
But little did Roger know, he had a rival. The most powerful man in the Philippines, President Ferdinand Marcos. In 1965, Marcos had been democratically elected. But he rapidly became a pathologically greedy dictator.
Money was extremely important to Ferdinand Marcos. He loved it like nothing else.
And there was only one person who could match Marcos's greed. His shopaholic wife, Imelda.
Marcos wooed Imelda, it is said, by taking her down to the vault beneath his bank and just showing her enormous great stacks of $100 bills. Whether or not this is true or not, I don't know, but it's extremely likely. And I should think it almost certainly would have convinced her that she was onto a good thing.
But Imelda's lavish lifestyle wasn't the only reason Marcos needed money.
The richer you were, the more powerful you were. It's that simple. It's a very simple equation.
And nothing could make Marcos more powerful than finding Yamashita's gold.
It's not at all surprising that Marcos was interested in Yamashita's gold because he was a thug, basically, and the mere thought of the promise of gold, and he would have been onto it like a shot.
Compared to Roger, Marcos had a serious advantage in the hunt for Yamashita's gold. Power.
It was incredibly easy for Marcos to use his power to find the gold. He has entire armies at his disposal. Armies, ships, experts on maps and deciphering all sorts of clues.
Despite all these resources, Marcos hadn't found anything, and so he devised a shrewd strategy.
He was a brilliant politician, but he was also brilliantly corrupt. On the surface, he seemed to be a rational person, going by the law, by the books, but in person, he was quite ruthless.
Marcos passed a law demanding treasure hunters apply for a permit, detailing where they were going to start digging.
He comes up with the permit system because this way he has all the enthusiastic treasure hunters all across the country working for him because they've now told him where they think the treasure is.
He's just waiting to see if anyone finds it, then he can move in because he has the resources to do that. And you know, that's very smart.
Meanwhile, back in Baguio, in 1970, Roger married. With a new wife and child on the way, he needed Yamashta's gold now more than ever. And so Roger dutifully applied for one of Marcos's permits.
Roger did everything the right way. He thought that if he followed the rules that had been put in place by the government, he would be able to search, he would be able to find and excavate and recover, and it would all be done with the blessings of the government.
In Roger's town, the person who manages the application is none other than Marcos's uncle.
In May 1970, armed with his permit, his map, and Akubo's information, Roger decided to risk everything to find Yamashta's gold. He spent all his life savings hiring a team of laborers. Together they started hacking their way through the thick jungle vegetation near Baguio General Hospital.
So it was really difficult for Roger to find the tunnel near the hospital because it was 25 years before that it was blasted shut. And every single year in the rainy season, these jungles, you know, they change their look and feel dramatically.
Then, after 2 weeks of almost non-stop searching, Roger spotted the mouth of a cave. Could this be the entrance to the treasure vault Akubo told him about? A 100 meters into the tunnel, a collapse meant Roger couldn't go any further. But for Roger, this was a good sign. He knew the Japanese had used dynamite to blast their treasure vaults shut. And so Roger and his crew began the arduous task of clearing the way.
The conditions for Roger and the team digging in the tunnel would have been horrific. It was hot, there were insects, there were snakes. It was very, very hard work.
Digging the tunnel was very, very dangerous. And Roger knew that if this really was a tunnel that the Japanese had built, there may be booby traps.
But Roger was willing to risk his life to get to Yamashta's gold.
Once you get that gold fever, it is insatiable. You just cannot quench that appetite. He was becoming obsessed. One more spade, one more rock. I'm going to get it. This is going to be the treasure of a lifetime. And everybody's going to say, yes, you found it.
Finally, after 4 long months of digging, they broke through. It was then he made a grim discovery. Skeletons dressed in rags. But these weren't just any rags. They were Japanese military uniforms. Surely these were the remains of the engineers who had hidden Yamashta's gold, only to be buried alive by Yamashita himself.
He thinks he's there, and he knows now that he has all the pieces to the puzzle. He is literally at the threshold of the gold recovery that he has sought now for 10 years. It's there, it's within his fingertips grasp.
Stretching beyond the skeletons was a vast network of tunnels. Roger and his team spent weeks exploring them. Day after day, they found nothing.
The next day, he was out there ready to go again. He knew it was there. He believed in his heart of hearts that that gold was there. He was going to go after it no matter what.
But a full 6 months on from finding the entrance to the tunnel, Roger still hadn't found any treasure.
Roger had spent all the money that he had raised to start the dig to begin with, and no one was going to give him any more money.
No money meant no crew. It seemed the hunt was over. Roger had squandered his life savings on a huge mistake. Just before Roger decided to give up once and for all, he had one last go with his metal detector. Then he heard its telltale buzz.
This buzz that Roger got from his metal detector must have been the best sound he'd ever heard in his life.
Roger was stunned. Hiding behind the wall was a gold statue of Buddha.
This was that moment in life that you would look back on and you say, yes, I have achieved my goal for my entire life. This is it. This find is the most significant find of anything that anybody had discovered in the Philippines.
The Buddha was in the Burmese style. According to the legend, the Japanese had looted religious artifacts from temples right across Burma. He really must have found one of Yamashita's 175 treasure vaults. And that wasn't all. The area around the Buddha was stacked full of wooden boxes. Finally, it was payday.
The gold that Roger has just discovered is worth a fortune. Each of those bars is worth $1,000, and he estimated there were over 1,000 boxes of the gold bars. So you're talking an incredible amount of money, more treasure than even he ever dreamed he would find. I mean, this has surpassed his wildest expectations.
Roger returned home with the Buddha, planning to go back for the gold with trucks and men. But the more he looked at the statue, the more curious Roger became. There was something about it that wasn't quite right. Buddha was full of diamonds.
The value had just gone off the chart.
Roger, I mean, he's getting richer and richer by the minute. He has 1,000 boxes of gold bars, he has a gold Buddha, and now he has handfuls of diamonds.
That night, Roger documented his life-changing find. News of Roger's miraculous discovery soon spread to the presidential palace.
I can just imagine him going crazy when the word had gotten to him. Marcos was going to do anything to get that Buddha away from Rojas, and it was going to eventually sit in Marcos' palace.
Unfortunately for Roger, Marcos's primary tactic was brute force. On the 5th of April 1971, it's said a group of mysterious men turned up at Roger's house.
Rojas didn't answer the door.
You have to ask yourself, how would you feel if all of a sudden at 2:30 in the morning, there's loud banging and knocking on the door? I think he'd be panic-stricken, and I'm sure he was.
They said, "You have 3 minutes to open the door or we're going to shoot you right here." They took everything away from him.
Can you imagine the feeling of violation? His entire life, he's looked for this, he's found it, and now it's been taken.
But if Marcos thought he could intimidate Roger and his family, he was wrong.
Roger had risked everything to find this gold, and he wasn't going to let it go so easily.
Roger reported the theft to the police.
By that time, President Marcos had a considerable stranglehold on the police and the army particularly.
But Marcos did not yet control the media. Within days, the press picked up Roger's story.
It was a huge scandal. You know, there's stolen loot, it's World War II, it's the Japanese, it's Marcos being implicated.
The newspaper was full of articles that were nothing short of calling Marcos a common thief.
The hostile press coverage came at a critical time for Marcos.
He was widely known to have fixed his second term of office, the elections, which were ludicrously corrupt. I mean, he allegedly won by 2 million votes. It was just impossible. He was widely lampooned on all sides for corruption, and he was beginning to feel himself quite insecure.
Marcos needed to silence this treasure hunter fast. There was one obvious solution.
The Marcos regime was notorious for extrajudicial executions. You'd have death squads basically killing people who were seen as being very critical of the regime.
But this time, Marcos needed a different approach.
I think by that time he must have thought that the story had enough public exposure for him not to be able to risk just making Roger vanish, like a lot of his opponents.
3 weeks later, Roger at last received some good news. He was told his Buddha was waiting to be collected at the courthouse in Baguio. When he got there, he was in for a shock.
When Roger saw the Buddha, he knew immediately this wasn't the Buddha that he had found. It was a different color, different shape, facial expression. The head didn't come off.
Marcos is expecting Roger to say, yes, that's the Buddha, thank you.
But he didn't know Rojas. Rojas was determined he wasn't going to let that Buddha up. And this was a huge mistake for Marcos because he had misread Rojas' personality.
Roger declared the Buddha was a fake.
I I think that was completely reckless of him, because by that time he would have known that he was a marked man, and to cause that kind of fuss, effectively tackling Marcos himself at a personal level, would have been absolutely ridiculous and very stupid, in my view. However, he did it. He clearly was a very stubborn man.
Now he's publicly given him two fingers. Really, this marks the beginning of the end for Roger.
Just over 2 weeks later, more mysterious men came for Roger. And it seems it wasn't long before interrogation turned to torture. Over several days, Roger said he was repeatedly burned with cigarettes. He was beaten. And electrocuted. Eventually, Roger claimed he signed an affidavit stating Marcos had nothing to do with the theft of his Buddha, and revealed the location of the thousands of gold ingots.
Roger was a very broken man when he signed that affidavit. I mean, there he was fighting publicly, but now admitting that no, there was no wrongdoing. He must have been completely demoralized.
Marcos had Roger imprisoned and wasted no time helping himself to the rest of Roger's find. But eventually Marcos's megalomania would prove his undoing. In 1986, a popular revolution forced Marcos and Imelda to flee the country. The Filipino people stormed Marcos's presidential palace, and what they found inside was unbelievable.
They were amazed at what they found. They found treasures of statues and art and thousands of pairs of shoes. This is just what they left behind.
Marcos was by far and away the wealthiest man alive. They were so wealthy, they didn't really know what to do with their money.
One of the questions for the Filipino people was, where had the Marcoses' enormous wealth come from? For most, there was an obvious answer.
Marcos's wealth primarily came from theft, embezzlement, and corruption. And you can look back, I think, on their joint reign as simply being a plot of self-enrichment. And the administration of the Philippines was merely a secondary item.
They were basically using the public treasury as their piggy bank.
Years later, while on trial for fraud and embezzlement, Imelda Marcos's defense declared their fortune was not looted from the Philippine treasury, but actually came from finding Yamashita's gold.
I think Imelda claimed that their joint wealth came primarily from finding Yamashita's gold because it was a very good blind. Nobody could prove otherwise. Yamashita's gold was just a wonderful alibi.
But for Roger Rojas, none of this mattered. His life was in ruins.
Roger never fully recovered from his torture. And the damage is so great that he can't see out of his right eye for the rest of his life after this. He's lost his money, he's lost his self-respect, he's lost his wife. Roger has lost everything.
Despite all this, Roger still had a bit of the spirit that had helped him find the gold.
It's a treasure hunter's mentality. They must get to the end of the story. They must get the treasure. Anyway, Roger had lost so much, he had nothing to lose.
With Marcos in exile in Hawaii, Roger filed a lawsuit against him. Even when Marcos died 1 year later, in September 1989, the case continued.
You could say that the Marcoses actually got away with it. He went out, lived his exile in Hawaii and died of natural causes. You could well say that they did rather well out of it.
It would take a further 7 years before Roger was at last vindicated. In 1996, the jury concluded Marcos had stolen Roger's find. $43 billion in damages were awarded.
When the court finds in Roger's favor, it's a significant moment in legal history. $43 billion is awarded to Roger, which is the biggest civil lawsuit award in history.
Sadly, Roger never saw justice done. On the eve of his day in court, he died. He was just 49 years old. Then, in 1998, the huge compensation award was overturned. While no court has challenged the verdict that Marcos stole Roger's treasure, how to determine its value is still being fought out by the lawyers.
It's hard not to look back at Roger and feel empathy for this man. His determination was boundless. And I think, if nothing else, Roger was a hero. And I think that's how he's going to be remembered.
He was willing to be David against Goliath. He was willing to put his life on the line, and therefore my hat off to him.
Roger's tragic story begs the question, was what he found a one-off? Or as the legend states, are there another 174 treasure vaults still waiting to be discovered? Since the war, treasure hunters from across the world have scoured the Philippines in search of Yamashita's gold. Yet none of them have found anything. Nonetheless, people are still willing to risk their lives looking.
Searching for Yamashita's gold is a very dangerous activity. Even to this day, I think it was in 2000, 2 men were buried alive looking for treasure.
What drives them is their certainty that Yamashita's gold is still out there.
The legend of Yamashita's gold in the Philippines is huge, and it hasn't died.
It endures because it's real, because there really are burial sites. There really is gold bars, gold dishes, gold treasures that are still to be found in the islands of the Philippines.
Deserts are brutal, bare, and barren. But one desert in Southern California is said to hold something truly astonishing.
The lost ship of the Mojave is one of the greatest legends that were ever told.
According to the myth, somewhere in the Mojave Desert is a shipwreck.
The idea that a ship got lost inland in the desert is unheard of.
And this isn't just any ship.
Oh, it's laden with gold, it's got silver bars, it's got jewels, black pearls, it's got everything under the sun.
But could it possibly be real? One man believed it was.
He was convinced that there was a ship out there. He just doesn't know where.
His search would take him across one of the harshest environments on Earth.
The desert can reach temperatures of 120 to 125 degrees, and then that's in the shade.
There are no settlements, there's no support crew, there's nowhere else for him to turn.
If you're not properly prepared and you head out to the desert, you will die.
This is the amazing story of Charlie Kluska and the mystery of his quest for the legendary lost ship of the Mojave Desert. In 1847, the man who would risk everything to find the lost ship was in search of a new life. Demobilized from the army after fighting in the Mexican War, Charlie Kluska decided to head west to America's new frontier, California.
To Charlie, California would have been this place of extraordinary possibility. California, even in the 1840s, was a place of magic. The very name signified fertility, potential, underexploited mineral wealth, a place where white Americans like him could go and potentially make their fortune.
But getting there was far from easy. It involved a perilous journey of over 2,000 miles that would take Charlie more than 3 months.
Charlie took the southern overland route to California. This was the cheapest way of getting to California. It wasn't the quickest, and it definitely wasn't the safest. This wasn't the journey for the faint-hearted. You had to endure huge heat, cold, snow, mud, as well as desert conditions. This was a difficult, arduous process.
And it wasn't just the environment that was hostile. Charlie's route crossed the heartlands of fierce Native American tribes.
Charlie may well have been worried about possible Indian attack. He may well have heard some rumors about that. In a sense, you were taking your life in your own hands.
But instead of attacking Charlie, it seems that when he met one tribe, the Kawiya, they told him a tale he would never forget. They said the desert was once covered with a great stretch of water. One day, a great bird with white wings came floating down. It stopped. Then the water went away, and the bird was left lying in the sands. Its white wings fell down, leaving a tall, bare tree sticking up. After a while, the wind blew and blew, and the bird was covered with sand. Charlie couldn't stop thinking about the story. He was sure it wasn't describing a bird.
He puts two and two together. He's thinking the white wings of the bird sound an awful lot like the sails of a ship. And the tree sounds very much like the mast of the ship. And all of a sudden, for him, it's starting to make sense.
But how could there really be a ship in the middle of the desert? Charlie and the Kawia tribe were miles away from the sea. And so Charlie put it to the back of his mind and carried on to California. In spring 1848, he finally arrived in Los Angeles. But it wasn't what he expected.
When Charlie arrives in California at the beginning of 1848, it's still essentially a wilderness. There's barely a population of 20,000 in a vast expanse of territory. The city that's going to become San Francisco has fewer than 1,000 residents. So really, it's a vast expanse with very few people in it. And the people who are there are mainly ranching cattle.
It's nothing like what he envisioned. You know, he was thinking it was going to be the land of milk and honey and prosperity, but it's barren. No one's there. There's no prosperity, and he's really disappointed.
After just 2 weeks in California, Charlie packed up his bags and headed for another new American territory, Texas. A decision he would come to regret.
Charlie made a major error. He clearly didn't give California a chance.
He's impatient and he leaves at the worst possible time.
In 1848, the California Gold Rush began.
As news spreads of the gold rush, then so too does gold fever. And gold fever spreads across America, it spreads throughout the globe. There is a mania to get to California. And as far as everyone's concerned, every second counts. It's not just getting there, but it's getting there quickly, it's getting there near to first as you possibly can to get the easiest and the richest pickings.
In 1849 alone, more than 50,000 people crossed America in search of gold.
Suddenly, everyone wants to be in California. People from China, from Europe, from Australia, from South America, all are fixating on getting to California. That's the one goal.
When Charlie heard about the gold discoveries, he was 1,600 miles away in Texas.
Charlie would have been absolutely kicking himself when he found out about the discovery of gold in California. He could have been in on it. He could have been one of those who made incredible riches.
He hears about it in Texas at the same time that everyone else is hearing about it. He's lost any advantage he may have gained by being in California in those earliest days of the gold rush. Now he has to do what everyone else is doing, which is get back to California as quickly as possible.
And so Charlie set off for the West once again.
As Charlie heads to California for the second time, he is fraught with anxiety. He wants to get the gold, and every hour he's not in California, someone else is mining the gold that should be his. Charlie's second journey to California was nothing like his first, which was him alone. The second time, there are hundreds and even thousands of people doing the same thing he is. So it's almost like a super highway, not so much the speed, but the fact that there's so many people making the same journey that he is on.
And when Charlie arrived in California, it had been transformed.
It's completely unrecognizable. He can't believe his eyes. It's like nothing that he remembers the first time.
Whereas previously it had been relatively empty, unpopulated, Now, all of a sudden, this was a bustling, anarchic place with a large and dynamic and ever-expanding population. It was suddenly a place where everything seemed to be happening.
When Charlie arrives, I mean, he essentially arrives in the most exciting point in the most exciting country in the world at this moment. He's really arrived at the place in the world that is the centre of the action.
In this frenzy, Charlie wasted no time staking his claim.
If you wanted to stake a claim, you had to do it physically. You had to literally go and drive a stake into the ground and defend your turf.
At first, Charlie's luck was in. He found what he'd come for.
So Charlie must have felt absolutely elated the first time he found gold. It was his dream since he set out from Texas, but he had this fear that it would be all gone by the time he got there. But it wasn't. He found some.
But after this initial small success, it seems Charlie's luck ran out.
After the easy pickings are gone, Charlie, like many other miners, is faced with the fact that getting hold of other gold remains in the ground is going to be much harder work. You're going to need more equipment, you're going to have to invest heavily in whatever claim that you have. Obviously, none of that came cheap. Shopkeepers are price gouging as hard and as fast as they can. There is a limited supply of the things that are necessary for life, whether it's food, whether it's shovels, and so shopkeepers charge what they like.
But Charlie would not give up his quest for gold. He was in the grip of gold fever.
A kind of madness that possessed some of these people. Especially if, like Charlie, you have one stroke of luck early on, then like a gambler, you want more and you want more.
But Charlie's losing streak continued.
As more and more people make their way to California, competition increases, the struggle for land, for good claims increases, and so Charlie's chances of really finding gold, of really striking it rich, get less and less every year.
Charlie found himself in a desperate situation.
The dark side of the expectations and the hopes and the dreams of the gold rush is the crushing bitterness and the disappointment.
By 1855, the Californian gold rush was largely over. After 6 years of trying, Charlie had failed to make his fortune.
Charlie's experience of the gold rush is very common. Very few people, very, very few people achieved this fantastical dream of sudden wealth. The people who made money from the gold rush were the merchants, the people selling equipment, the people providing services, the people supplying food.
In 1862, news broke of gold discoveries in neighboring Arizona. Charlie headed south to try again. His route took him back across the lands of the Cahuilla tribe that he traveled through 5 years earlier. And it seems his mind turned back to the incredible story of the ship stranded in the desert he'd heard all those years ago. Could the Native American story be more than a myth?
The idea of a ship getting lost in the desert seems like a fantasy, seems like a folklore tale or a myth, but the reality is it can happen.
The Kauai story suggested this area of the desert was once covered in water. In fact, this was true, and it was called Lake Kauai.
The Native American myths actually oftentimes relate to real historical events. It's entirely possible that the myth of the bird could relate to not only a real historical event, but that event could be the creation and evaporation, and the creation and evaporation of Lake Kauai.
Lake Kauai was tremendously important for all the Native Americans in the area. It was a lifeblood. It's how they basically lived. They needed the water in order to survive. There's remnants of the old shoreline all over the desert.
Geological studies have shown that since around 700 AD, the Colorado River has filled an area called the Salton Sink many times, forming Lake Kauai. Each time, the lake would eventually evaporate, returning the area to desert once more. But it's thought that at times, the lake wasn't just an isolated stretch of water. In the years Lake Kauai was full, some experts believe that when the Colorado River was in flood, it formed a link between lake and sea.
There is scientific proof out there that the waters can actually connect to Lake Kauai, and it's easily possible for a ship to get up into that particular area.
But any ship that found its way into the lake would soon have been left high and dry.
Once the ship would have entered Lake Kauai, the receding waters would not allow the ship to leave the area.
If that was so, there really could be a ship in the desert. And it could still be out there. In September 1870, Charlie was now in Southern California, still hunting for good pay dirt. When, the story goes, he picked up a copy of his local newspaper, the San Bernardino Guardian. While scanning the pages, a small article caught his eye. It told of a ship that had been spotted out in the desert.
A party of Americans found embedded in the sands the wreck of a large vessel.
He must have been flabbergasted. He's thinking, ha, I knew it, see? It does exist.
Nearly 1/3 of the ship is plainly visible.
You can imagine his eyes just popping out of his head as he reads this.
The description made it sound like a ship worth finding.
The stump of the bowsprit remains, and portions of the timbers of teak are perfect.
He's seeing dollar signs because the ship sounds like it's big, and he knows that a big ship is always carrying cargo.
And Charlie started to wonder what sort of cargo it was carrying. At the time, speculation was rife that the wreck was a lost pirate ship. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, the Gulf of California was teeming with Spanish ships. Here, enterprising pirates preyed on mighty galleons, carrying priceless treasures from all over Asia back home to Spain.
Oh, it's laden with gold, it's got silver bars, it's got jewels, black pearls, it's got everything under the sun.
The newspaper article even told Charlie where to look. The ship lay just under 70 miles away, 40 miles north of the San Bernardino-Fort Yuma Road and 30 miles west of Dos Palmas.
Charlie wanted to set out for the ship as soon as possible because it's been published. Now he knows he's not the only one who wants to find the cargo. There's going to be competition, and he doesn't want to be second on the scene like in the gold rush.
Charlie started preparing to head into one of the harshest environments on Earth.
Crossing the desert in Charlie's time would have been a tremendous undertaking. You can go for days without seeing a soul. It's a forbidding place, that's for sure. If you're not properly prepared and you head out to the desert, you will die, period. The expedition is very, very risky. You would face death almost on a daily basis.
There were several things that were out there that could threaten his life. Coyotes, wolves, snakes. There's other miners, Mexicans coming up from the border. You had the local Native Americans.
There are no settlements. There's no support crew. There's nowhere else for him to turn. Charlie had to take with him everything he thought he was going to need.
Dry foods, a jerky type of meat, beans, bacon, anything he could get his hands on that would get him through the day. He would have to really be very cautious about what he took, how much he took of it, and why he was taking it.
Charlie knew there was one thing he needed to take above all else: water.
The desert out in that area can reach temperatures of 120 to 125 degrees, and then that's in the shade.
The water points out in the desert are not something you can get to within a day.
The lack of water for him or his animals would mean he would be stranded out there, and if his animals went without water, he would have a long walk to get back to some water source, which would have meant surely probably death.
This is not something for the average Joe that would be working in San Bernardino.
But Charlie wasn't your average Joe.
Whether in his childhood or more recently during his military service, Charlie would have been used to living in wild areas of one form or another. He would have significant experience of using firearms, so that would have been extremely useful when it came to protecting himself and possibly even finding food. So Charlie had survival skills.
But finding the ship was such a massive undertaking that Charlie felt he needed help.
Charlie could have done it by himself, but I think it makes a lot more sense to go out in a party. You could easily make one mistake and die on your own. So people or a group of adventurers or travelers was highly important.
He probably didn't have that much trouble finding people that were interested in going out looking for the ship. I'm sure he probably had people that were volunteering to go with him.
On the 1st of October 1870, Charlie's team set out. At first, they followed a route he knew well. This was the trail he had taken to try his luck in the Arizona goldfields in the early 1860s. From San Bernardino, they followed the old Bradshaw Road, working their way through the San Gorgonio Pass and down the Coachella Valley to Martinez. But soon they would find themselves in totally uncharted territory.
Charlie wouldn't have had a map. Finding his way was going to be a difficult task.
The Mojave Desert is one of the most difficult places to navigate, especially in Charlie's time. You can look out on the desert and what may appear to be a mile or two actually be 30, 40 miles. So at first you may think, not a problem. But the reality of the situation is when you get out there, it's a whole new ballgame. Most of their traveling was done with what we call dead reckoning. They would look for certain objects or certain places that they would remember, and they would know at this particular rock grouping we would turn left. But then if you're in a place where you don't know where you are, you can get lost very quickly.
But after days of struggling to find their way, Charlie was sure they were getting close to the ship's location.
Charlie must have been so excited when he realizes he's only 10 miles away from the ship's reported location, and there's a chance they can make it there by nightfall.
Then, something happened that filled Charlie with panic.
Charlie sees that the tracks that he's making are starting to fill up with water.
And he realizes that he's standing in quicksand. It was really a horrific situation for Charlie. He's in the middle of nowhere and his horse is disappearing into the sand. He's gonna lose his horse, he's gonna lose everything, he's gonna die. He has to pull the horse out and it's screaming and the hair is being ripped off its legs. And it's signaled to Charlie, this is too dangerous to go on, he must retreat.
Charlie returned to San Bernardino. Despite his narrow escape, he started planning his next expedition immediately. Even though his companions were less than enthusiastic about returning to the desert, Charlie couldn't wait to head back out there.
It's the prospector mentality he has that failure's part of the job and he needs to persevere. Only next time he needs to be even more prepared.
This time Charlie was determined he would not fail. He gathered together as many wooden planks as he could get his hands on to help him cross any challenging ground. Just 3 weeks later, on the 5th of November 1870, Charlie set out into the desert once more. He was certain he would find the ship. He even took a different route to avoid the quicksand that had foiled his first attempt. But it wasn't long before Charlie was in trouble again.
It seems that Charlie is so preoccupied with the horrific experience with the quicksand that this time he's forgotten to bring the basics.
First, his food supplies ran out.
If you're out on the desert and you run out of food, you're pretty well doomed. Even if you were lucky, you could kill a rattlesnake and probably eat it. But there wasn't a lot to eat out on the floor of the desert in that area.
Despite his gnawing hunger, he plowed on towards where he was convinced the ship lay. Then, Charlie ran out of water.
Running out of water on the desert is huge. You're facing death. You gotta find water now, not tomorrow, not the next day, now.
You simply cannot survive these conditions without water, and Charlie, the very best, he's got a couple days left.
Even though he was still 30 miles away from the ship's reported location, Charlie didn't turn back for water. He carried on into the desert.
I think it'd be crazy, because when you're out in the desert and you're facing the possibility of dying because there's no water and you're still focused in on a lost ship, oh, that's huge.
Then Charlie spotted something on the desert floor that told him he was getting close. These shells convinced him this area was once linked to the sea. Now, there was no way he was turning back.
After a couple days in the desert without water, keep in mind, it's 100 degrees plus every day. Charlie would have been in a really bad way.
Dehydration started to kick in.
Your muscles would start to ache. Your sense of direction would probably be off.
Diminished eyesight, tremendous headaches. the inability to be coherent. He was in a very serious, very bad state. He needed to get some sort of help or at least water as soon as possible.
Charlie realized he had to turn back.
Charlie would have been extremely frustrated. I mean, this is the second time I'm this close and I have to turn away. I bet that just irritated him to no end.
Utterly dejected, Charlie took one last look around. Suddenly, something on the horizon caught his eye. At first, he thought his eyes were deceiving him. But as he gazed through his telescope, he was convinced he could see the mast of a ship. And it wasn't just any ship. It was huge, about 250 feet long. A mighty Spanish galleon.
So when Charlie sees the ship, he would have been so excited. The story is true, the myth is true.
Charlie's location of the lost ship would make sense. In the area that he was talking about, the ancient shoreline for Lake Coahuila was right there. So it makes absolute sense that the ship could have been there.
Charlie was desperate to get to the ship. But by this stage, he was close to death.
Physically, he would have been completely drained. His body was done.
There's no way Charlie could have physically gone on. He sees the ship, he wants to go forward, but he has no choice but to retreat, for he had to go back or die.
But Charlie still wasn't defeated. When he arrived back in San Bernardino, his mind was already full of plans for his return.
Charlie was extremely determined to go back out, find the ship, and put the legend to rest.
Word of his adventures quickly spread.
The town would have been going crazy. Town would have been back and forth talking to everybody. Hey, did you hear the news? Oh my God, they found the ship.
When Charlie gets back to San Bernardino, he's like a rock star. So he becomes a bit of a local celebrity.
Joshua Talbot, the editor of the San Bernardino Guardian, was just about to go to press when Charlie returned. But he was anxious to report the local hero's amazing discovery.
It has all the elements that readers are looking for. It's a story of individual adventure. It's into a mysterious and essentially unknown part of California still. So it's romantic, it's exciting, and it also has the possibility of treasure at the end of it as well. So this is a story that's really almost tailor-made for the California market.
Talbot published, "The ship has been found," and promised his gripped readers a full account in next week's edition. But a rival newspaper beat Talbot to the scoop.
He's interviewed by the Alta California, which is really the premier newspaper. It's the newspaper with the biggest circulation in California at this time.
There was huge competition among newspaper editors to be the one who was first on a story, and Charlie's story was an extraordinary one and one that could sell newspapers.
Soon the story went national.
This story was picked up back east in the New York press, in the Cincinnati press, where Charlie came from.
Newspapers in Kansas, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, they run the story as well. So Charlie is becoming increasingly famous across America.
Charlie's story had become big business. Talbot couldn't afford to miss any more scoops. He decided he must join Charlie's next expedition.
This kind of first-person testimony that he's going to bring to it is really going to help to enliven the story and to really sell it to his readership. The San Bernardino Guardian is a relatively new newspaper as well at this point. It's founded in 1867, so you can imagine that this also seems like a good story to try and make the name of this newspaper on.
And Talbert's interest was potentially very valuable to Charlie.
I think it's very likely that the editor of the San Bernardino Guardian was paying Charlie for access, paying to, as it were, embed himself in Charlie's expedition in order to be the first on this story and to have exclusive access to interviews and to be there with Charlie when he makes this great discovery.
Whatever the case, it seems Charlie was much better funded for his third attempt to find the ship. This time Charlie had a wagon large enough to carry 108 gallons of water, food for 2 months, and he had another crew.
He's not leaving anything to chance. This will be the trip that he actually gets to the ship.
On the 30th of November 1870, they plunged into the desert.
Charlie's attitude when he sets out for the third expedition is one of defiance. There is no way he will be stopped. He has enough supplies for a small army, and he's determined to succeed at any cost.
To ensure he didn't run out of water on his latest campaign, Charlie had a new strategy that involved yet another route. He approached the ship from a rare water source in the desert, Carrizo Creek. But the terrain on this new approach was tough. Progress was slow.
There's small rolling hills, there's large mountains, there's deep depressions, it's sandy.
He would be lucky if he averaged 10 to 15 miles a day.
Worse, from this new angle, Charlie seemed to struggle to identify any of the landmarks he'd noted on his last mission that he needed to find his way back to the ship.
Landmarks change. Those sand berms have a tendency to move. You know, what could be under 40 feet of sand today could be barren tomorrow. The desert is a living, breathing thing.
Days turned into weeks, and Charlie still hadn't found the ship.
Talbert was expecting the ship to be found, expecting Charlie to say, here it is, this is where it's at, this is what we have, let's take a couple artifacts so we can prove that we actually found the ship and be done with it. But in reality, the desert takes a long time to explore. Talbert would have reacted to the desert in a very harsh way. As a newspaperman, not realizing what the trials and tribulations would be like out in the desert. I think a very short time out in the desert, he had enough.
You can imagine what Talbert is thinking as really every hour that goes by, he's losing more and more confidence in Charlie. He's losing more and more confidence in the story.
Eventually, after 20 days, Talbot abandoned the expedition. He had a newspaper to run. Charlie stayed out in the desert for a further 3 weeks, but he still couldn't find the ship. After 6 weeks, he too returned to San Bernardino, empty-handed.
So when the third expedition fails, like the first two, Charlie is absolutely gutted. He has spent 6 weeks. He has every supply he needs, but he returns without a single piece of evidence that the ship exists. Inevitably, the press loses interest in Charlie. Failures don't sell newspapers.
Utterly defeated, Charlie abandoned his quest for the lost ship of the desert. It all begs the question, if he had really seen it, why couldn't Charlie find the lost ship again?
In hindsight, you have to wonder, is there any way Charlie could have seen a ship on that second expedition that wasn't really there? And of course there is. The man is dehydrated. He's ready to die. He hasn't had water in days.
And when people are severely dehydrated, they can hallucinate. So, was Charlie hallucinating? There is another possible explanation. That Charlie really did see a ship, but it was a mirage.
The desert can play some very, very funny tricks on you. You may see something, you may swear it's there, and it's not there. It's something called a mirage.
In contrast to a hallucination, which exists only in the mind, a mirage is a real optical phenomenon. Differences in air temperature cause light rays to refract, to form a false image. But interpreting what the false image is depends on the mind of its observer.
Charlie wanted so bad to see that ship that he just imagined something that wasn't there.
But Charlie had been adamant that what he'd seen was real.
They even asked him if it wasn't a mirage, if he was quite certain he had saw the ship. And he, without a doubt, verified that he had saw the ship, that he had a telescope that was of good quality, and he knows exactly what he saw.
There is another, more disturbing possibility. Back in his office, Talbot started to write up his adventures with Charlie. And he started to focus on some strange patterns in Charlie's behavior.
Talbot can't help but notice that Charlie doesn't appear to really be in a hurry. He's taking his time, he's looking around him, as though he's looking for something along the way, as opposed to having his eyes set on the ship off in the distance.
And that wasn't the only thing that struck Talbot as odd.
If he knew what it was, he'd go straight there. But every day he goes into a different direction. And this leaves Talbot to wonder, what is it that he's really looking for, the ship, or could it be something else?
In fact, Charlie's routes on each of his 3 expeditions seemed to make no sense. Talbot started to wonder, what was Charlie really up to? Each time he approached the ship from further and further away, searching a broader and broader area. And each time from different compass points. Talbot realized this wasn't the behavior of someone trying to find the ship's reported location. Perhaps Charlie wasn't really searching for the lost ship. Perhaps he was hunting for something much closer to his heart. Gold.
It would make sense that Charlie was looking for gold simply because old habits die hard.
It's in his blood. It's what he's done for decades now.
But if Charlie was really after gold, why claim to be searching for a lost ship? From his years of prospecting, Charlie knew there was one thing above all a miner needed to be successful: money.
Money for supplies, for tools. for everything he would need to stay in the desert for weeks to try to find the gold.
Charlie's problem was how to get the funds he needed.
Charlie's method for finding gold in the desert is really quite cunning.
For Charlie, the ship was potentially a means to an end. If he claimed to be hunting the legendary lost ship, Charlie was no longer just another prospector looking for financial backers. He was a hero.
Charlie would have wanted media attention, I imagine, because it would have been a way of raising money. If he can attract this kind of attention, then he can get people to invest in his expedition.
Everybody would have known that he was looking for the ship, so it would have been quite easy for him to get just about anything he needed in order to go on an expedition.
So was it all a tall tale to get money? Charlie was definitely a man who could spin a yarn.
He claims that he was playmates with Abraham Lincoln as a young boy, at a point when Lincoln was certainly nowhere near where Charlie Clusker was.
Whatever the truth, Charlie went on to live to a grand old age. He died in 1915, aged 105. A local tribute made no mention of his quest for the lost ship, but it did sum him up rather well.
Mr. Clusker was a typical prospector and miner. Sometimes he had wealth in hand. Always, he possessed wealth in prospect.
But does that mean there never was a ship in the desert? Over the years, many claim to have seen it.
In 1892, there was one. In 1907, there was one. In 1933, there was one. In 1944, there was one.
The puzzling thing is, all these people see different ships, including a Viking longboat, though how that might have got into the Californian desert, nobody can explain. And that's not the only problem with the numerous lost ship sightings.
Nobody seems to see the ship twice. They'll see it, get all excited, retreat, mount another expedition. They never see it again. And that's all symptomatic of the fact that it wasn't there in the first place. If the ship really exists, you'd be able to find it a second time, and you would surely be able to bring something back.
Despite all this, still, the legend lives on.
The legend of the lost ship has continued, will continue, and when all of us here are said and gone, it will still continue.
For some, there will always be a lost ship in the desert.
I absolutely think there's a lost ship out there, and I would love to find it.